My name is Wai Yee. I am Associate Professor and Lee Kong Chian Fellow at the School of Law at Singapore Management University.
My name is Christopher Chen. I'm an Associate Professor of Law in the Singapore Management University.
Our project looks at legal transplantation of corporate and securities laws in Hong Kong and Singapore. When we think about legal transplantation, we think about the laws in developed nation where the laws and regulatory framework is fairly transparent, and we bring that into the recipient country or jurisdiction. There are many reasons why legal transplantation is good, particularly for developing countries. For example, if you want to increase the confidence of the investors and you transplant what are regarded as global best practices in Western countries, you can say that we are following the best practices in the Western countries. Legal transplantation, however, is fraught with a number of difficulties. One is that the transplantation may not actually occur in the way that it is intended. So when we look at the shareholding structures in the Western countries, UK and US particularly, those countries in the West are characterized by companies with very dispersed shareholdings. When you look at Singapore and Hong Kong, they are characterized by companies with concentrated shareholdings. Why does corporate fraud continue to occur despite the fact that Singapore and Hong Kong have adopted the Western models of corporate governance, the characteristics of independent directors, in particular improving the monitoring expertise on the board of directors? What we have done is to look at the board characteristics of the companies that have been engaged in fraudulent behavior, and we compare that with a matched sample of companies which have not found to be fraudulent. Our next finding is that when we look at the two sets of companies in question, foreign listings tend to be more prevalent in the cases of the fraud companies than the non-fraud companies. Foreign listings refer to the situation where the companies only utilize the jurisdiction as a place of listing. In other words, their management, their assets, operations are all outside the jurisdiction of listing. But they use the place of listing in order to raise funds in the initial public offering. We find that there are significant risks associated with the foreign listings. This finding is not really surprising because the top management and the directors, at least the executive directors, are not within the jurisdiction. It's very hard to enforce against them. We are not saying that all the foreign listings are associated with fraud, but these are the challenges that the policymakers have to take into account. Both Singapore and Hong Kong have pushed for foreign listings very aggressively. We understand that this is important because this is required in order to deepen our respective capital markets.
We also observed the two markets. We first identified the difference in law in Hong Kong and Singapore. We select Hong Kong and Singapore partly because those are the two financial market centers in Asia. And both markets share a common legal heritage, yet both markets have different paths, so the rules are not exactly the same. The most of the regulation are not the same. Singapore tend to reverse some of the rules for legislation. Hong Kong may be sometimes more akin to use soft law. But leaving those things aside, we also observe that Hong Kong law, why they move so fast, is partly because they have very aggressive media. So those factors offer us a good chance to evaluate the difference in the impact of law on the market. The empirical part is we try to measure the cases of squeeze outs, how they do in the legal context. What we want to measure is that whether the difference in law can have a different impact on the market. Do they actually reach the same goal of protecting investors, and whether it produces the results that the lawmakers want to achieve? After all, the capital market is heavily regulated by statutes, and the listed company need to comply with a lot of rules. So what we want to know is that whether the law, when introduced out of a foreign country or introduced by a regulator, how do the market actually respond to the rules? How do they interact between market participants and the law? Based on our data, we can examine whether the law is effective or whether it's too stringent or too lenient. And that will in turn help regulator to decide what to do next.
Now, being able to control corporate fraud is very important because fraud undermines the investors' confidence. It is a very difficult issue. There are no easy answers. We hope that the policymakers will take into account our findings and recommendations as they engage in policy reform.